Good morning, everyone. To start, let's take a look at this quote by Karl Orff. Tell me, I forgot. Show me, I remember. Involve me, I understand. From this, it emphasizes the importance of active participation in learning, suggesting the true understanding comes from personal engagement rather than passive reception of information. Good morning once again. My name is SAB and I will be talking about communicative language teaching. At this juncture, we will know the definition, background, characteristics, principles, and goals of communicative language teaching. But first, what is communicative language teaching? So communicative language teaching, or CLT, is different from traditional teaching. It focuses more on how to use the language in various contexts or in real-life contexts rather than focusing on grammar rules. Its goal is to help the students become more fluent and able to communicate using the language in various situations while also learning grammar through practical contexts. One example is a role-playing activity, such as a job interview. So learners can take on different roles such as interviewers, interviewee, and they have the freedom to choose or use language functions such as greetings, expressing qualifications, and asking questions, and many more. So in a nutshell, talking about CLT or communicative language teaching, this is an approach that is based on the principle that in order to learn the language, one must communicate or one must practice the language in order to communicate meaning to others. Now, how does communicative language teaching originates? In the late 1970s in Europe, students were able to read and write sentences using the target language. However, they struggled to communicate effectively. This highlighted the need for more than just mastering the linguistic structures. Consequently, there was a shift from mastering the linguistic structures to a communicative approach in the late 1970s and 1980s. Therefore, talking about CLT, this approach has its roots and its changes to the British language teaching tradition, which adopted the situational language teaching. Situational language teaching is a method to teach basic grammar within meaningful situation. So to understand more, let's take a look at this example.
Look at this picture. This is Kamal. 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 Where does he work? Is that a supermarket?
No, it's a stall.
A stall, yes. A stall is a little shop. It's not a big shop like a supermarket. A little shop. A stall. He works in a stall, yes. I'm going to tell you about an ordinary day for Kamal. Every day.
He get up in 5 o'clock.
Sveta?
He get up in 5 o'clock.
Okay, the idea is good. Can you make the sentence better?
He get up at 5 o'clock.
At, good. At 5 o'clock. Okay, this word. Listen. Okay, Bruna?
He gets up at 5 o'clock.
Very good. Listen. He gets up at 5 o'clock. Listen. He gets up at 5 o'clock. Everybody?
He gets up at 5 o'clock.
Very good. Again.
He gets up at 5 o'clock.
As we can see from the example, the teacher provided the situation first, allowing all the learners to create their own sentences out of the situation, as he gradually corrected their structures. That is situational language teaching. As we observe, students still struggle to communicate effectively. Therefore, linguists Noam Chomsky, Dalheims, and D.A. Wilkins developed the communicative language teaching. Let's get to know Noam Chomsky first. So Noam Chomsky developed the notion of competence, which he asserted was the goal of language learning. Competence here is defined as the formation of all possible generating structures in the mind, from which any one structural element or utterance comes out as a product. So the common name for the latter is what we call the performance. So it's like having a toolbox full of rules and structures of the language. Basically, competence is knowing all the grammar rules and structures in your head. However, performance is like taking out a tool from your toolbox and using it to build something. So performance is the real-life use of the language. Let's take a look at this picture. What have you observed? That's right. So in the competence part, Tarzan's sentence was grammatically correct. However, going down to the performance, in his utterance, there are some errors. So that is the difference between competence and performance, and that is the notion of Noam Chomsky. However, his idea was rather too idealistic for some linguists. Thus came Dalheims, who coined the term communicative competence. Heims referred to it as the aspect of competence that enables one to convey, interpret, and negotiate meaning interpersonally within specific specific context, and it was divided into 4 components. First, we have the grammatical or linguistic competence. Second, the discourse competence. Next is the social cultural competence, and lastly is the strategic competence. So defining each of the term, grammatical competence is basically a competence that refers to the grammatical and lexical capacity of the learner. Meanwhile, discourse competence is concerned with the interconnectedness of a series of utterances, written words, and or phrases to form a text as a meaningful whole. Next is the social cultural competence, is the understanding of the social context in which communication occurs. And lastly is the strategic competence. It refers to the communicator's communicative strategies to initiate, terminate, maintain, repair, and redirect communication. So those are the 4 components of Dalheim's communicative competence. Meanwhile, D.A. Wilkins sought to propose a functional or communicative function of language based on which a syllabus can be developed. Instead of the traditional teaching of grammar, he categorized meaning into 2 as he focused more on meaning. And this category are notional and communicative function. So let's take a look at this example first. So as we can see, the notion here is food and drink. The function are describing and offering. The structure is how's it taste, and there's a can in the fridge. So basically from this, we can say that notion is what is being talked about, and the function is the purpose for using the language. And the structure is the way it was expressed or being uttered to the other person. Hopefully you were able to understand that, because those are the theories that establish communicative language teaching. Keeping those in mind, let us now move on to the principles of communicative language teaching. According to Doughty and Long 2003, there are 8 principles for communicative language teaching. First is the task as an organizing principle. It has something to do with a focus on meaning by giving learners a purpose to use grammar in a meaningful context. So from this, communicative grammar must be taught by using different tasks. For example, giving the learners a task to organize a welcome dinner. With this, the learners will be able to discover and learn the language on their own as they organize or arrange a group of international students at dinner table based on the students' hobbies, age, and languages they speak. Second, we have learning through doing. So it refers to how new knowledge can be better retained in long-term memory if it is tied to real-world events and activities. For example, learners need to actively produce language. Only in this way they can try out new rules and modify them accordingly. In short, learners need to actively use the target language in real-life conditions in order for the learner's linguistic knowledge to become automatic. So that is the learning through doing. Moving on to the third principle, rich input which needs to be meaningful, comprehensible, and elaborated. The assimilation of new knowledge heavily depends on how easily it can be attached to already existing knowledge. For example, teaching vocabulary through real-life scenarios, ensuring students grasp meanings, usage, and context. So it is also important for the teacher to expose the learners with input that are already relatable or relatable to the existing knowledge of these learners. Because again, an input will not be meaningful unless it is comprehensible. Connecting to the fourth principle, we have the authentic materials. So materials need to be authentic to reflect real-life situations and demands. Maximize the use of the target language. So authentic materials are those materials that are not made especially for pedagogical purposes. For example, announcements, conversations, and discussions taken as extracts or as a whole from radio and television, public broadcasting, real-life telephone conversations, messages left on answering machines, or voicemail. So those are the examples of authentic materials. Next, the fifth principle is promotion of cooperative and collaborative learning. So pairing or grouping students and working cooperatively in a task facilitated by the teacher. For example, a pair or group discussions where students work together to solve a problem or complete a task, fostering communication, negotiation, and mutual understanding. So in this fifth principle, students are required to actively participate in the communicative task as they negotiate meaning with their classmates. Sixth principle we have is the focus on form. So focus on form emphasizes a form-meaning connection, teaching grammar through communicative context. In this principle, the students will be able to figure out the grammar rules themselves as they perform the communicative task and form a connection between form meaning within context. So for example, in a conversational activity where students discuss their weekend plans, the teacher may subtly correct them or indirectly correct their verb tense usage, such as, I go to the movies on Saturday, says the student. The teacher will indirectly correct the students, so you went to the movies last Saturday. What did you see? And with that, the learners will be able to realize the connection between the form and the meaning of the sentence. Seventh is the provision of error corrective feedback. So feedback is categorized into two. We have the positive feedback, confirms the correctedness of the students. Negative feedback, or the error correction, has a corrective function on a student's faulty language. So as we can see from the example, the verb tense of the student was corrected by the teacher, but at the same time, after the student was able to say or utter the correct structure of the sentence, the teacher praises the student. So that is provision of error corrective feedback. With this, the student also will be able to compare the difference between the utterance they said and the feedback from the teacher, and from there, they will be able to learn the structure and how to properly use the sentence. Now let's move on to the eighth and last principle of communicative language teaching, which is the consideration of affective factors of learning. So learning a language, especially foreign language, is really a difficult process for some, and thus the role of anxiety is always there. According to the affective filter hypothesis of Krashen, language learning must take place in an environment where learners are off the defensive, and affective filter, which is anxiety, is low for the input to be noticed and gain access to the learner's thinking. Additionally, Gardner and McIntyre, 1993, put it, a learner who is motivated, wants to achieve a particular goal, devotes considerable effort to achieve this goal, and experience in the activities associated with achieving this goal. Therefore, for the eighth principle, it is necessary for both the teacher and learners to recognize the affective filter or the affective factors of learning in order to be able to create a conducive environment where learners can freely express themselves without discrimination. So that is the eighth principle. So now let's move on to the characteristics of communicative language teaching. And according to Brown 2001, there are 6 characteristics of CLT. First, classroom goals should focus on all components of communicative competence. Therefore, a learner must be able to participate in group activities showcasing grammatical accuracy, managing discourse effectively, convey ideas functionally, grasp social nuances, and be able to create strategies to overcome communication barriers. So that is the first one. The second characteristic is language techniques should engage learners in the pragmatic, authentic, functional use of language for meaningful purposes. So as an example, you could give your students a role-playing activity wherein they need to simulate a real-life scenario such as ordering in a restaurant or negotiating a business deal. So with this, they will be able to use the language authentically in a practical context, and at the same time, they will be able to consider social context and the appropriateness of language choices. Third, we have the fluency and accuracy are complementary principles underlying communicative techniques. So with this, you could have a time discussion wherein the students are encouraged to spontaneously share their ideas. With that, their fluency will be developed all throughout the activity. So for instance, in the picture, the teacher asked what I did on my holidays. The fourth characteristic is language should be used productively and receptively. As an example, a task could be involving students writing a persuasive essay, followed by a peer review session where they read and provide feedback on each other essay. So with this, the student will be able to produce and comprehend language effectively. The fifth characteristic is the activities are learner-centered, and the learners focus on their own learning process. So with this, students might take a self-assessment activity, identify their strengths and weaknesses, and set their own pace of improving themselves, especially with their learning process. So they will be able to take control of their own learning process. Sixth one is because the teacher's role is only to be a facilitator. So the teacher's role is mainly as a facilitator to guide the learners in the interaction that takes place in the classroom. So they may intervene to provide some feedbacks, but learners are the one who are learning and actively participating in the process. Those are the characteristics of communicative language teaching. So now let's ask the last question. What is the goal of communicative language teaching? So as what we continuously discuss, the goal of communicative language teaching is for the student to achieve communicative competence. So communicative competence highlights the importance of not just knowing the language, but also understanding the social and contextual aspect of communication. It is more than just mastering the linguistic competence of the language. And that is communicative language teaching. Again, communicative language teaching, or CLT, is an approach that aims to achieve communicative competence rather than linguistic competence competence through learner interaction. It originated in Europe in 1970, replacing the situational language teaching. Its main developers are Noam Chomsky, Dalheims, and D.A. Wilkins. Noam Chomsky proposes the notion of competence, meanwhile Dalheims for communicative competence, and D.A. Wilkins for the two categories of meaning, which is notional and functional. So communicative competence as defined is the ability to achieve communicative goals in a socially appropriate manner. It includes verbal and non-verbal behavior. And we have discussed the 8 principles of CLT by Doughty and Long 2003, and the 6 characteristics of CLT by Brown 2001. Here are the references of my report, and I hope you were able to gain something new today. Thank you so much for listening.